This is the notes video for the Russian Revolution for World History 2. So up until this point, World War I has been going on, and the Russians have been fighting against the Germans, opening another front. And here's the map of the Russian Empire as it was during the reign of Tsar Nicholas II. Now it's kind of a funky looking map because it's a Mercator map. So here's another example of kind of more. The red dot up at the top is going to be St. Petersburg, and the red dot in the middle is going to be Moscow, but you can see how they cover all of Europe and Asia, the Euro-Asiatic plains. But there are a lot of problems going on in the empire, even starting before World War I. So the first problem is that they were defeated in the Russian-Japanese War in 1905. If we go back over here, you can see how Russia has expanded all the way to the Pacific coast towards Japan. Japan and Russia are both going to fight over the Korean peninsula. Eventually, because the majority of the Russian population lives in the western part of the country, in the European side of the country, they have a hard time getting troops or well-trained troops over towards the Asiatic side to fight Japan, and so Japan ends up winning rather easily. The diplomats actually end up meeting in the United States and are led by Teddy Roosevelt to come to an agreement to end the war, with more going to Japan than Russia. Other problems in Russia include that the peasants are landless. They are not allowed to own land at this point in time, or if they do, they own very little of the land. So we have a super poor population with a really rich population. The Tsar and the aristocrats live in a very high aristocratic European lifestyle. You can see them eating at the table down here. The women are wearing fancy dresses, whereas most of the peasants are still living in a manner as they would have in the early 1800s. Russia is barely industrialized. They do have some factories, and they do have some, factories making iron and cannons and things like that. They have some railroads. They have some factories making cotton, but for the most part, they are still very agricultural. However, they have severe shortages of food and fuel due to issues with failing harvests and with problems of going into World War I and needing all of the food for the troops on the front and fuel for the troops on the front, and that means the peasants back home don't have very much. There are also a lot of leadership troubles. While Tsar Nicholas II was a very nice guy, reportedly, he was not well trained as a ruler, and he did not really have any military ability or military smartness, shall we say. And so he was going to lead to some problems. Now, of course, you all have heard about the story of how his son, Alexis, the Tsarevich, who's going to be the next king, the crown prince, and the 4 daughters. Alexis had hemophilia, which means that your blood doesn't clot. And so if you get a cut or even a bruise, you run the risk of basically bleeding out. And so their mother, Alexandra, turns to Rasputin, a reputed holy man, who says he has a cure for Alexis's hemophilia. Now, of course, we all know Rasputin best from our lovely Disney movie Anastasia, but Rasputin basically gets to a point where he's very powerful and he's able to make decisions for the queen and king, as the king is off fighting World War I, and the queen is kind of left to deal with all of the problems at home. A bunch of nobles try to kill Rasputin. He is known to have tried to have been assassinated about 7 times, and nothing works. Eventually, they do assassinate him, but not before some troubles break out. In March of 1917, in the middle of World War I, there is the March Revolution, and this is when Lenin, who you can see up here in the corner, is going to give a speech in the center of St. Petersburg, which was their capital at the time. This is called the Winter Palace, and he gives this speech in front of the Winter Palace, basically saying that we need to revolt against shortages of food. Tsar Nicholas tries to order in the troops to take down the revolt and clear the square, but the troops side with the revolt and with Lenin, and the Tsar's authority is going to collapse. At this point, the Tsar is forced to resign or abdicate, and they move to a provisional or temporary government, which is a republic. Make sure you know that a provisional government is the same thing as a temporary government. A good vocab word there. So at this point, Tsar Nicholas, who's seated here in the center, has abdicated, and we move to a provisional government led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky, who's down here in the lower left. But his biggest mistake is that he continues to fight in World War I. Now, World War I was a big problem for the Russians because, again, it meant to all the food shortages, and they kept losing battles. They weren't doing very well. And so Lenin has created a group called the Bolsheviks, and they are going to take over from the provincial government. And the Bolsheviks want the idea of communism. They were followers of Marx, and they believed that communism was the way to solve the problems of the Russian Empire. And they were able to take over from the provisional government because the population was so unhappy with not only the Tsar and the way that World War I was being run, but also the continuation of fighting in World War I under the provisional government. So, when the Bolsheviks take over from the provisional government, the real revolution begins, which actually ends up being kind of a civil war in Russia. But what the Bolsheviks do is to first get out of World War I. They're going to sign what we call the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which basically gives Germany all of this land in pink to the Central Powers, and Russia is now left with everything up here in white, and the Bolsheviks are able to remain in power. They don't bring the provisional government back or anything, and the Germans move back, and now the Germans are able to fight only on that Western Front against France and England. And thank goodness the United States had just come in, or else the Germans would have won World War I. So, what happens in the Civil War in Russia is the whites are fighting, who are anti-communists, and they want to get rid of the Bolsheviks. They are usually known as monarchists. They want to bring back the monarchy, so groups of aristocrats and merchants maybe. And they're going to receive help from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. The U.S. actually sends some troops over to Russia in the middle of World War I to help fight against the Reds. But for the most part, what the U.S. sends is money to the whites. They also send equipment and tanks and things like that. The Reds, or the Bolsheviks, are going to eventually win because of support from the population, the general population like the peasants, and because of what they call war communism. They nationalize everything, which means that the central government, the Bolshevik government, is going to control the entire economy for the duration of the war to make sure that it's all running towards their side of the war. The Reds create a secret police unit, which will become the father of what today is the KGB. They promote the idea of Russian unity, which the peasants support, as opposed to all of the help from these outsiders like the British, the French, and the United States and Japan. And the Bolsheviks capture and execute the Tsar and their family, which leads to the end of any kind of monarchy within the Russian Empire, which means that, of course, we get the story of Anastasia potentially surviving, which at this point in time we've basically debunked and know that Anastasia did not survive. So once the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, in 1921, they form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or commonly known as the Soviet Union. At first, they're led by Vladimir Lenin. He takes the Bolsheviks and turns them into the Communist Party. And the big thing to know about Lenin is that he creates what is known as the New Economic Policy. Lenin did not believe in full 100% communism. He wanted a mix of communism and capitalism. So he creates building industry and agricultural plans where the government controls all of the banking and the heavy industry, so like the big factories. But they allow small businesses and farms to trade freely, and people can actually own businesses. So if you want to own a bake shop, you can own a bake shop, which in a sense has an aspect of capitalism in it. So Lenin is not 100% communism. Lenin is a mix of socialism and capitalism with his new economic policy. Lenin is going to die, unfortunately, and we lead to Joseph Stalin as our next leader. Now, Joseph Stalin is born in a territory called Georgia, part of Russia, not anywhere near Atlanta, and adopted the name of Stalin as a child or as a student, which relates to the idea of steel, as he was a strong person. Now, he was a good student. He was introduced to socialism and Marxism in school, but was eventually kicked out of school for developing some radical ideas. Now, from there, he joins the Communist Party under Lenin. And during the Revolution of 1905, when Lenin is in exile over in Germany, Stalin is going to help lead the fighting squads, which rob banks to raise money for the Bolsheviks. He then further rises in the ranks of the Communist Party, and after the death of Lenin, Stalin is going to win the power struggle and become the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin then kind of moves away from Lenin's plans from the new economic policy and creates what are known as the 5-year plans. Smart idea to set economic goals for 5-year periods, but Stalin is going to basically go with the idea of 100% communism, moving away from the mix of capitalism and socialism of Lenin to straight communism. So he's bringing all industrial and agricultural production under government control through what is called collectivization, where the state now owns all of the farms, so you cannot own your farm as a farmer. You now work on the state-owned land. And your businesses are taken over by the state as well, so you may manage a business, but you can't own a business. And so within 10 years, the USSR transforms itself really from an agricultural society to much more of an industrial one under Lenin. Now, it's not going to be as industrial as the United States, and they're still very far behind where the United States was, but they are trying to catch up. Now, Stalin is going to set the tone for the future government of the Soviet Union. He dies in 1953. But the other part of Stalin is that he establishes one of the most brutal dictatorships the world has ever been seen, or the world has ever seen. He tries to establish total control, even over members of his own party, using secret police. He uses propaganda. He does everything he can to instill fear. And he hosts what are known as the Great Purges, where political rivals, peasants, anyone who opposes Stalin, even his former aides, are going to be purged, or essentially either exiled to Siberia, or basically a mass killing. We think between 20 to 40 million people die under Stalin through these great purges. Some of it is through what is called the Ukrainian genocide, where all of the food that Ukraine grows, Ukraine has really good land for growing wheat, but all of that wheat was taken and given to the rest of the Soviet Union, and none was left for Ukraine, and so there are periods of starving, which they call the genocides, caused by Stalin. So Stalin basically creates a very totalitarian government. Now, the government takes total centralized control over all aspects of public and private life, which means Stalin controls where you live and work, what you eat, how you dress, how much money you make. He's controlling almost every single aspect of your life, potentially even to a point if he decides who you marry. I don't know that he ever actually did that, but he could have. Now, remember, within all of this, Stalin is going to participate in World War II, fighting against the Germans. They are going to see the Germans invade the Soviet Union and be successful for a while, until at least the Soviet winter is going to push the Germans back out due to German unpreparedness. But all of this is going on during that and after that, as Stalin is the dictator. So you can see a political cartoon from Russia. Sometimes it's called the CCCP, which is the Russian for USSR, abbreviated. And Stalin is kind of the leader of the state, and so he uses a lot of propaganda to make people feel good about working for the Russian communist state, and be happy for trying to defeat those evil capitalists in the West, the United States. And so we enter this period after World War II, where the United States and the Soviets are going to face off as the two big superpowers of the world.